The candle beside Catherine's inkstand has burned lower than it should have by this hour, its flame dancing against the December wind that finds every crack in the winter palace's ancient stones. A letter lies half-finished beneath her hand, the imperial seal warming in the candlelight, waiting to bind secrets that cannot travel by daylight. Outside, fresh snow muffles the footsteps of the few souls still moving through St. Petersburg's frozen streets, but here in this private study, the Empress of all the Russias works on, as she has every night for 23 years. I am your DrowZy historian, and tonight we slip into the spaces between the official records, into the quiet hours when empires are truly built. Catherine the Great suffered from what her physicians called an excess of mental vigor, a condition that kept her awake long past the hour when even her most devoted courtiers had retired to their chambers. But what the court saw as insomnia, history might better understand as opportunity. For in these midnight hours, away from the ceremonial demands of daylight, Catherine conducted the real business of ruling the largest country on earth. The letter beneath her fingers bears no address that would appear in any diplomatic registry. Its contents, when finally sealed and dispatched, will travel through networks of correspondence that operated entirely outside the formal channels of state. These were not the grand pronouncements that fill the history books, but rather the quiet negotiations, the personal appeals, and the careful intelligence that held an empire together across 11 time zones. Catherine's handwriting grows smaller as the night deepens, her German script flowing across paper that bears no imperial watermark. She has learned through decades of rule that the most important communications must appear unremarkable. The heavy parchment and ornate seals that announce imperial authority serve their purpose in daylight ceremonies, but the letters that actually move the machinery of power travel disguised as private correspondence between friends. Her inkstand, a gift from Voltaire, holds ink mixed with a particular formula known only to her private secretary. Under certain lighting conditions, additional text becomes visible between the lines, not the crude invisible inks of common spies, but something far more elegant. Catherine understood that true secrecy lies not in hiding information, but in making it appear to be something else entirely. The clock in her study chimes twice, its sound muffled by the thick carpets that line these private apartments. Somewhere in the palace below, a door closes softly. Catherine pauses in her writing, listening to the particular quality of silence that follows. Each sound in the Winter Palace at this hour carries meaning for those who know how to interpret it. The soft footfall of a trusted messenger, the creak of floorboards in the corridor that leads to the foreign ministry, the distant whisper of sleigh runners on snow, carrying dispatches to destinations that will not appear on any official itinerary. She folds the letter carefully but does not yet reach for the sealing wax. Instead, she moves to the window, where the view encompasses the frozen Navar River and the scattered lights of the city beyond. From this height, St. Petersburg appears as a constellation of warm windows against the Russian winter, each light representing households that sleep peacefully under her protection. But Catherine knows that several of those distant candles burn in windows where other correspondence is being written. Other decisions made that will ripple through the empire in ways that daylight diplomacy could never achieve. The Winter Palace at midnight becomes a different structure entirely from the grand ceremonial spaces that foreign ambassadors visit during official hours. The same corridors that echo with the rustle of court dress and the measured tread of formal processions now stretch empty and moonlit, their marble floors reflecting whatever light filters through the tall windows that face the river. These halls, built to impress visitors with the power of the Russian throne, transform in darkness into something more intimate passages between private worlds where the real work of empire takes place. Catherine's apartments occupy a corner of the palace where two wings meet, providing her with views both toward the city and across the palace courtyards, where the business of government continues even in these quiet hours. Her private study connects through a series of smaller rooms to chambers where her personal staff maintains the networks of communication that link her to every corner of her domains. But the connection is subtle, designed to appear accidental to anyone who might map the palace's official layout. The corridor outside her study stretches toward the apartments of her private secretary, a journey that takes exactly 3 minutes at the measured pace appropriate for midnight consultations. The walls along this passage display no portraits of previous rulers, no maps of conquered territories, no symbols of imperial power. Instead, they hold landscapes of the Russian countryside, gentle scenes of peasant life and seasonal change that speak to the domestic heart of even the most powerful ruler. Tonight, as on most nights, this corridor will see traffic that appears nowhere in the palace's official records. Messages will pass between chambers, decisions will be made that affect the lives of millions, and the quiet machinery of absolute power will continue its work while the capital sleeps. The servants who facilitate these midnight consultations have served in the palace long enough to understand that discretion is not merely expected, but essential to the smooth functioning of the state. Catherine returns to her desk and takes up the letter again, adding several lines in a different ink, one that will fade within a few days, leaving behind text that appears to discuss nothing more sensitive than the weather and the health of mutual acquaintances. She has perfected this technique over years of correspondence with allies and agents across Europe, creating a system of communication that allows for the frank exchange of information while maintaining the appearance of innocent social contact. The sealing wax she selects is deep blue rather than the imperial red that marks official communications. Blue wax indicates personal correspondence, beneath the notice of anyone who might intercept such letters during their journey. But the shade of blue carries its own meaning, a particular hue that signals the recipient to examine the letter more carefully, to look for the additional layers of meaning that Catherine has embedded in seemingly casual observations about court life and personal matters. As she presses her personal seal into the warm wax, Catherine considers the network of similar letters that will be dispatched from the palace before dawn, each one carefully crafted to appear unremarkable, each one carrying intelligence or instructions that help maintain the delicate balance of power across an empire that spans from the Baltic to the Pacific. The system she has developed over decades of rule allows her to govern not through the crude exercise of absolute authority, but through the more subtle art of appearing to be everywhere at once, while actually being precisely where she needs to be. The finished letter joins several others in a leather portfolio that shows no imperial insignia. Tomorrow, or rather later this morning, these letters will begin journeys that will take them to Moscow, to Kiev, to the distant territories along the Black Sea where Russian influence continues to expand through means that owe more to careful correspondence than to military conquest. Each letter will travel by routes that appear random, but follow patterns known only to Catherine and her most trusted agents. Outside, the snow continues to fall, adding another layer to the accumulation that will muffle the sound of sleigh runners when the time comes for these messages to begin their journeys. Catherine has learned to read the winter weather as carefully as she reads the political climate, understanding that the harsh Russian seasons provide both challenges and opportunities for those who know how to work with them rather than against them. The palace courtyard below her window shows signs of the discreet activity that marks these midnight hours. A sleigh waits in the shadows near the servants' entrance, its driver patient and unobtrusive. The horses stand quietly in their traces, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. This scene will repeat itself several times before dawn, as different messengers arrive to collect the various types of correspondence that flow from Catherine's private study to destinations across her empire. Each sleigh that waits in the courtyard tonight represents a different network of communication. Some carry letters destined for the formal diplomatic channels that connect St. Petersburg to the courts of Europe. Others transport messages intended for the informal networks of merchants and scholars who provide Catherine with intelligence that never appears in official reports. Still others bear correspondence addressed to the network of governors and administrators who translate imperial policy into local action across the vast Russian territories. Catherine moves to a cabinet that holds maps of her empire, selecting one that shows the Black Sea region in particular detail. The territories marked in red represent recent additions to Russian control, gained through negotiations that owed more to careful correspondence than to military campaigns. Each new province required months of delicate communication with local leaders, offers of autonomy and protection that had to be precisely calibrated to local conditions and concerns. The map shows routes marked in different colored inks, indicating the various networks through which information and instructions flow between the capital and these distant regions. Some routes follow official postal roads, but others trace paths through merchant networks, religious communities, and scholarly institutions that provide more reliable communication than the formal channels of government. Catherine has learned that empire is built not just through conquest, but through the patient cultivation of relationships that make conquest unnecessary. She traces one particular route with her finger, a line that runs from St. Petersburg through Smolensk and Kiev to the Crimean Peninsula, where Russian influence now extends to territories that were Ottoman just a few years ago. This expansion happened not through dramatic military campaigns that would have attracted European attention, but through a series of local agreements and negotiations that each appeared unremarkable in isolation, but collectively shifted the balance of power across the entire region. The letters that traveled this route over the past months carried offers of trade privileges, guarantees of religious freedom, and promises of protection that proved more persuasive than threats of conquest. Catherine understood that the Ottoman Empire's weakness lay not in its military capacity, but in its inability to provide the kind of local governance that populations actually wanted. By offering a more attractive alternative, she could achieve through correspondence what would have required years of expensive warfare. Her attention turns to another section of the map, where the Ural Mountains mark the boundary between European Russia and the Siberian territories that stretch toward the Pacific. Here too, the expansion of Russian influence follows patterns established through careful correspondence rather than dramatic conquest. The network of fur traders, Orthodox missionaries, and military administrators who represent Russian authority in these distant regions maintain their positions through constant communication with the capital, reporting local conditions and receiving instructions that allow them to adapt imperial policy to local circumstances. The letters that travel these routes must be crafted with particular care, since they may take months to reach their destinations, and the situations they address may have changed significantly by the time responses can be received. Catherine has developed techniques for writing correspondence that remains relevant even when circumstances shift, creating instructions flexible enough to be adapted to changing conditions while maintaining clear connections to overall imperial policy. She selects a fresh sheet of paper and begins another letter, this one addressed to a merchant in Astrakhan who serves as an unofficial representative of Russian interests along the Caspian Sea trade routes. The letter appears to discuss nothing more sensitive than the quality of various goods available for trade, but embedded in these commercial observations are instructions for gathering intelligence about Persian political conditions and opportunities for expanding Russian influence in the region. The merchant who will receive this letter maintains similar correspondence with dozens of other traders across the region, creating a network of information and influence that operates entirely outside the formal structures of diplomacy. Through such networks, Catherine can monitor political developments across Central Asia and respond to opportunities for expanding Russian influence long before formal diplomatic channels would even become aware of changing conditions. As she writes, Catherine considers the different types of wax and ribbon that will mark this letter for its journey. The merchant correspondence requires green wax, indicating commercial rather than political content to anyone who might examine the letter during its travels. But the particular shade of green, combined with the specific pattern of ribbon used to bind the letter, will signal to the recipient that additional attention is required to uncover the letter's true purpose. The system of colored seals and ribbons that Catherine has developed serves multiple purposes beyond simple concealment. Different combinations indicate different levels of urgency, different types of content, and different instructions for handling and response. A letter marked with blue wax and silver ribbon requires immediate attention but no written response. Gold ribbon indicates that a reply is expected within a specific time frame. Red ribbon means that the letter should be destroyed after reading, while black ribbon indicates that copies should be made and distributed to other members of the network. These visual codes allow Catherine's correspondence to process large volumes of communication efficiently while maintaining security appropriate to each message sensitivity. The system has evolved over years of use, becoming sophisticated enough to convey complex instructions through combinations of colors and materials that appear decorative to casual observers but carry precise meaning for those who understand the code. Catherine completes the merchant letter and sets it aside to dry, then begins work on another piece of correspondence, this one intended for a monastery near the Ottoman border where Orthodox monks maintain connections across religious communities throughout the Balkans. The letter will appear to discuss theological matters and requests for prayers, but will actually carry intelligence about political developments in the Ottoman territories and instructions for maintaining Russian influence among Orthodox populations under Ottoman rule. The monastic networks provide Catherine with some of her most reliable intelligence about conditions in territories she hopes eventually to bring under Russian protection. The monks who maintain these communications understand that their religious mission and their service to the Russian state are not contradictory but complementary, since Russian expansion often brings greater religious freedom to Orthodox communities living under Ottoman rule. The porcelain inkstand catches the candlelight as Catherine dips her pen once more, but this time she reaches for a different sort of correspondence entirely. Scattered across her writing table lie volumes bound in soft leather, their spines bearing names that make her pulse quicken with intellectual excitement. Voltaire, Diderot, D'Alembert, the French philosophers whose ideas have shaped her reign in ways her subjects could never imagine. Tonight, Catherine writes not as an empress but as a student. Her letters to Voltaire had begun years earlier, when she was still finding her footing on the Russian throne. The old philosopher had died in 1778, but his ghost haunts these midnight hours as Catherine continues conversations with his intellectual heirs. She writes to Denis Diderot in Paris, to Baron Grimm, who serves as her literary correspondent, to minds that challenge her assumptions about governance and human nature. The letter taking shape beneath her careful script discusses the establishment of schools in remote provinces. But Catherine's approach differs markedly from traditional Russian education, where Orthodox tradition emphasized religious instruction and obedience. Catherine proposes curricula influenced by Enlightenment principles, mathematics, natural philosophy, practical arts alongside religious studies. The careful balance required delicate explanation to her correspondents, who sometimes forget that implementing revolutionary ideas requires navigating conservative realities. Catherine pauses, reading over a passage where she describes her attempts to codify Russian law according to principles derived from Montesquieu and Beccaria. The Narcars, her great legal instruction, had drawn heavily on Western philosophical works, though she had been forced to moderate many proposals when faced with the practical realities of Russian society. Her French correspondents understood legal theory. Few grasped the complexities of governing a realm where serfdom remained the economic foundation, and where noble privileges formed the political bedrock. The candle flame wavers as she considers how to explain her latest educational reforms. Catherine has established the Free Economic Society, Russia's first economic organization, partly inspired by physiocratic theories she encountered in her philosophical reading, but translating theories about agricultural improvement and free trade into policies that work within Russia's existing social structure requires compromises that her philosophical mentors might find troubling. She writes carefully about her plans for expanding education to include women, a radical notion even among enlightened circles. Catherine herself embodies the contradiction, a woman wielding absolute power while advocating for broader female education in a society where women of all classes remain largely excluded from formal learning. Her correspondence reveals this tension as she seeks philosophical justification for reforms that her own position makes possible, but that challenge fundamental assumptions about gender and governance. The philosophical corner of her study contains works that would surprise many of her subjects. Rousseau's writings on education sit beside treatises on religious tolerance. Catherine's letters to her philosophical correspondents reveal a mind genuinely engaged with ideas about natural rights, social contracts, and the proper limits of governmental authority, even as she exercises power that would have horrified many of her intellectual heroes. Her pen moves steadily as she describes recent reforms to provincial administration. The new provincial statute draws inspiration from theories about rational governance and administrative efficiency, but Catherine must explain to her correspondents why certain Enlightenment principles cannot be immediately implemented. Religious tolerance, for instance, remains a delicate matter in a realm where orthodoxy provides crucial political legitimacy, and where religious minorities face suspicion from both state and society. Catherine sets aside the philosophical correspondence as another matter demands attention. The War Council chamber, though empty at this hour, seems to press upon her consciousness as she turns to correspondence of a different nature entirely. Maps spread across a secondary table show the complex territorial arrangements of Eastern Europe, where the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth struggles with internal divisions that create opportunities for neighboring powers. The Polish question requires the most delicate diplomatic choreography. Catherine's letters to Frederick the Great of Prussia and Empress Maria Theresa of Austria discuss partition with clinical precision, but the human costs remain carefully unmentioned. These midnight letters coordinate the dismemberment of a nation through careful legal fictions and diplomatic protocols that will make the process appear legitimate to European observers. Catherine writes to her ambassador in Warsaw, providing instructions that must appear as routine diplomatic correspondence while actually coordinating the complex process of partition. The letters discuss support for particular noble factions within Poland, financial arrangements that will secure cooperation from key figures, and military preparations disguised as routine border security measures. Each letter requires careful coding, since discovery could precipitate the very European war that partition is designed to prevent. The correspondence reveals Catherine's understanding that Poland's weakness stems partly from its constitutional structure, which grants liberum veto powers to individual nobles and makes effective governance nearly impossible. Her letters to philosophical correspondents had praised constitutional limitations on royal power, but her Polish correspondence demonstrates pragmatic appreciation for the administrative efficiency that absolute monarchy can provide. The contradiction troubles her during these quiet hours, when intellectual honesty competes with political necessity. Frederick's letters arrive through secure channels, outlining Prussian territorial interests and proposing coordination of military movements that will present Poland with fait accompli rather than opportunity for resistance. Maria Theresa's correspondence proves more complex, reflecting Austrian ambivalence about partition while acknowledging Habsburg territorial interests in Galicia. Catherine's responses must balance these competing concerns while advancing Russian objectives. The maps before her show territories that will bring millions of new subjects under Russian rule, but Catherine's letters focus on administrative challenges rather than moral implications. How to integrate Catholic and Jewish populations into a predominantly Orthodox empire. What legal frameworks will govern territories with established local privileges? How to balance the demands of Russian nobles who expect rewards for supporting partition with the need to maintain stability in newly acquired regions. Catherine's strategic planning room overlooks gardens now buried under winter snow, but her attention focuses on warmer regions where Russian expansion continues. The Crimean Peninsula appears on detailed charts that show harbors, fortifications, and population centers that will determine the success of her most ambitious territorial acquisition yet. The annexation of Crimea represents a different sort of challenge than Polish partition, where Poland's dismemberment involves coordination with other European powers. Crimean annexation directly challenges Ottoman authority and risks war with the Sultan's forces. Catherine's correspondence with military commanders discusses logistics and strategy, while her letters to European courts explain Russian actions in terms of protecting Christian populations and securing legitimate territorial claims. The chess game of European diplomacy requires careful moves across multiple boards simultaneously. Catherine writes to her ambassador in Constantinople, providing instructions for managing Ottoman reactions to Russian expansion. The letters must convey firmness without appearing provocative, determination without seeming reckless. The Sublime Porte understands power, but miscalculation could precipitate conflict before Russian forces are fully prepared. French correspondence requires particular delicacy, since Versailles maintains traditional alliance with the Ottoman Empire while also cultivating diplomatic relations with St. Petersburg. Catherine's letters to French officials emphasize commercial opportunities that Russian control of Crimean ports will provide, while downplaying strategic implications that French ministers understand perfectly well. The correspondence reveals diplomatic fiction's essential role in managing international relations. Austrian reactions prove more complex, since Habsburg territories include significant Orthodox populations who might welcome Russian protection. Catherine's letters to Vienna emphasize religious and cultural connections, while carefully avoiding language that might suggest broader Russian intentions regarding Habsburg Slavic subjects. The correspondence walks carefully between reassurance and implicit threat. The naval charts spread beside territorial maps show Black Sea approaches that Russian control of Crimea will dominate. Catherine's letters to Admiralty officials discuss harbour improvements and fleet expansion that will project Russian power into previously Ottoman waters. The strategic implications extend far beyond Crimean borders, potentially affecting grain exports, Mediterranean access, and the entire balance of power in southeastern Europe. Catherine turns from strategic correspondence to commercial matters, where empire and economics intertwine in ways that determine both state revenues and subject welfare. Her trade correspondence desk holds letters from merchants, provincial governors, and foreign commercial representatives, all seeking advantages in the expanding Russian market. The Merchants' Code operates through carefully structured relationships between state authority and private enterprise. Catherine's letters to the English-Russia Company discuss trading privileges and tariff arrangements, while her correspondence with Dutch merchants explores financial services that growing Russian commerce requires. Each letter balances state interests with commercial opportunities, recognizing that prosperity strengthens imperial power, while excessive regulation stifles beneficial trade. Letters from Arkhangelsk describe the northern trade routes that connect Russian timber and naval stores with European markets hungry for materials that domestic forests cannot provide. Catherine's responses coordinate state policy with merchant interests, ensuring that profitable trade generates revenues for imperial projects while providing incentives for continued commercial expansion. The correspondence reveals Catherine's understanding that Russian economic development requires both domestic reforms and international integration. Letters to provincial governors discuss road improvements, canal projects, and market town establishment that will facilitate internal trade, while foreign correspondence explores export opportunities that will bring hard currency into Russian territories. Manufacturing development appears frequently in commercial correspondence, as Catherine seeks to reduce Russian dependence on imported goods while creating employment for growing urban populations. Her letters to English technical experts discuss machinery imports and industrial instruction, while correspondence with German artisans explores craft development that will serve both domestic needs and export markets. Banking and credit arrangements require particularly careful attention, since Russian commercial law remains underdeveloped compared to Western European standards. Catherine's letters to Amsterdam and London financial houses discuss credit facilities and currency exchange mechanisms that will support expanding Russian trade, while domestic correspondence addresses legal frameworks needed to encourage commercial investment. The fortunes being built on imperial letters extend beyond individual merchant success to broader questions of imperial development. Catherine's correspondence reveals her understanding that commercial prosperity strengthens state power by generating tax revenues, creating loyal merchant classes, and demonstrating imperial competence to foreign observers. The letters coordinate policy across multiple domains, recognizing that successful commerce requires legal stability, physical infrastructure, and diplomatic relationships that protect trading interests. Catherine's diplomatic correspondence archive contains the most delicate materials of all, letters that manage relationships with European courts through careful attention to protocol, precedent, and personal relationships that often determine policy outcomes. The ambassador's dilemma involves balancing competing demands while maintaining the trust and access that effective diplomacy requires. Marriage negotiations appear frequently in diplomatic correspondence, since royal and noble marriages create political alliances that can determine war and peace across generations. Catherine's letters discuss potential matches for various Romanov relatives, evaluating candidates not only for personal compatibility, but for the diplomatic advantages that particular unions might provide. Each negotiation requires careful assessment of dowries, territorial arrangements, and religious considerations that complicate seemingly personal decisions. The portrait miniatures scattered across her correspondence desk show European royalty whose personal relationships with Catherine affect broader diplomatic relationships. Her letters to various courts must navigate personal friendships and animosities while advancing Russian state interests, recognizing that diplomatic effectiveness often depends on individual relationships rather than abstract policy calculations. Court protocol appears in numerous letters, as Catherine coordinates Russian ceremonial practices with European expectations while maintaining imperial dignity. Her correspondence discusses reception arrangements, gift exchanges, and precedence questions that seem trivial but actually reflect and determine political relationships. The letters reveal diplomatic communications' careful attention to symbols and gestures that convey political meaning. Intelligence gathering operates through diplomatic channels that provide information about foreign court politics, military preparations, and economic conditions that affect Russian interests. Catherine's letters to her ambassadors request specific information while providing guidance about cultivating sources and managing sensitive relationships that could provide crucial intelligence about foreign intentions. Commercial diplomacy intertwines with political relationships, as trade agreements and commercial privileges become tools of diplomatic influence. Catherine's letters coordinate economic and political objectives, recognizing that commercial relationships can either support or undermine broader diplomatic goals depending on how carefully they are managed. The candle burns lower as Catherine completes another evening's correspondence, but tomorrow will bring fresh letters requiring equally careful attention. The diplomatic marriages arranged by candlelight will create relationships that outlast the rulers who negotiate them, while the commercial agreements and territorial arrangements discussed in tonight's letters will shape European development for generations to come. Her correspondence reveals an empress who understands that effective rule requires constant attention to details that connect domestic governance with international relationships, philosophical principles with practical necessities, and immediate decisions with long-term consequences. The Midnight Cabinet continues its work, as Catherine prepares for sleep knowing that tomorrow's challenges will require the same careful balance of competing demands that tonight's correspondence has addressed. A jeweled magnifying glass catches the candlelight beside an open art dealer's catalogue, its pages filled with sketches of sculptures that might soon grace Russian halls. Catherine's fingers trace the outline of a Raphael drawing as she considers whether this particular masterpiece deserves a place in her growing collection. The correspondence spread before her speaks not of armies or treaties, but of beauty acquired through patient negotiation. Moving through the private galleries of the Winter Palace after midnight, Catherine enters rooms where her artistic correspondence takes precedence over affairs of state. Here, surrounded by paintings already purchased through similar late-night deliberations, she reads letters from dealers across Europe who understand that the Russian Empress possesses both refined taste and substantial resources for cultural acquisition. A letter from Paris describes a collection of ancient cameos becoming available through the estate of a recently deceased collector. The dealer's careful French explains that discretion is essential, as several other European courts have expressed interest in these particular pieces. Catherine makes notes in the margin, calculating not just the financial cost, but the cultural significance of adding such artifacts to Russian collections that will educate future generations about classical artistry. Her correspondence with Baron Melchior Grimm reveals the philosophical framework underlying these artistic purchases. Grimm writes from Paris about paintings that embody Enlightenment principles, suggesting that acquiring works by contemporary artists who celebrate reason and natural beauty serves both aesthetic and educational purposes. Catherine responds with questions about specific painters whose work might complement the philosophical text she has been collecting, creating galleries where visual and intellectual culture reinforce each other. Letters from Italian dealers describe sculptures that require careful transportation across challenging terrain, with detailed discussions of how to protect marble surfaces during the journey from Mediterranean workshops to Russian palaces. Catherine reviews proposals for custom-built crates and specialized shipping arrangements, understanding that successful cultural acquisition depends as much on logistics as on artistic judgment. The Hermitage rooms themselves reflect years of such correspondence, with paintings and sculptures arranged according to principles discussed in letters exchanged with European cultural advisors. Catherine walks among these acquisitions, remembering the midnight negotiations that brought each piece to Russia, while considering how tonight's correspondence might expand these collections further. A letter from Amsterdam describes rare manuscripts becoming available through a private sale, including illuminated texts that would complement the scientific and philosophical works already housed in palace libraries. The dealer explains the historical provenance of these documents, tracing their ownership through centuries of European scholarship, while Catherine considers how such manuscripts might support the educational institutions she hopes to establish. Her artistic correspondence reveals careful attention to regional Russian craftsmanship alongside European acquisitions. Letters from provincial workshops describe traditional techniques being adapted to create furniture and decorative objects that reflect both Russian heritage and contemporary aesthetic principles. Catherine responds with encouragement for these domestic artists, understanding that cultural development requires supporting local talent as well as acquiring foreign masterpieces. Correspondence with architects discusses how new palace rooms might be designed to showcase specific types of artwork, with careful consideration of lighting conditions and wall proportions that will enhance rather than overwhelm the pieces displayed. Catherine reviews architectural sketches alongside art catalogues, planning spaces where cultural and architectural elements work together to create environments suitable for both private contemplation and diplomatic entertainment. The candlelight flickers across letters describing musical instruments available for purchase, including harpsichords and chamber organs that would allow palace concerts to feature both European compositions and traditional Russian melodies. Catherine considers how musical and visual arts might complement each other in creating cultural experiences that reflect the sophisticated tastes she hopes to cultivate throughout Russian society. Moving to her provincial correspondence desk, Catherine encounters a different type of midnight challenge as she reviews reports from governors managing distant territories across the vast Russian Empire. The empire's nervous system of letters brings news from regions so remote that seasonal weather determines when correspondence can travel between provincial capitals and St. Petersburg. A thick packet of letters from Siberian administrators describes challenges managing indigenous populations who maintain traditional hunting and trading practices while adapting to Russian legal and commercial systems. The governor's careful reports explain cultural differences that require sensitive handling, suggesting policies that respect local customs while establishing imperial authority through consistent and fair application of Russian law. Correspondence from southern territories near the Black Sea discusses agricultural development projects that could increase grain production while providing economic opportunities for settlers willing to establish farms in regions previously used primarily for grazing. Catherine reviews detailed proposals for irrigation systems and crop rotation schedules, understanding that successful territorial development requires long-term planning based on careful observation of local conditions. Letters from Western provinces describe interactions with Polish and Lithuanian populations whose cultural and religious traditions differ significantly from those of Central Russian regions. Provincial administrators request guidance on managing these differences while maintaining imperial unity, suggesting approaches that accommodate local practices without compromising essential imperial policies. The correspondence reveals the complexity of governing an empire where communication delays mean that provincial decisions must often be made without immediate imperial guidance. Catherine reads reports describing situations where governors have implemented emergency measures during local crises, then sought retroactive imperial approval for actions that could not wait for letters to travel between distant territories and the capital. A particularly detailed report from a governor near the Ural Mountains describes mining operations that have discovered new mineral deposits while encountering unexpected geological challenges. The administrator's technical language explains extraction difficulties and requests additional resources for equipment and personnel, while Catherine considers how such discoveries might contribute to imperial revenues if properly developed. Letters from governors managing trading relationships with Central Asian merchants reveal the diplomatic complexity of maintaining commercial relationships that cross imperial boundaries. These administrators must balance Russian economic interests with the need to maintain peaceful relationships with neighboring powers whose cooperation is essential for profitable long-distance trade. Correspondence from northern territories describes the seasonal rhythms that govern life in regions where winter conditions make travel and communication nearly impossible for months at a time. Catherine reads about stockpiling procedures and emergency preparations that ensure these remote communities can survive periods of complete isolation from imperial support systems. The provincial reports demonstrate how imperial governance requires constant adaptation to local conditions that vary dramatically across territories spanning multiple climate zones and cultural regions. Catherine makes notes on letters that require immediate responses, while identifying issues that need longer consideration before imperial policy can be effectively formulated. Moving to her economic planning chamber, Catherine confronts correspondence about managing Russia's agricultural wealth, understanding that midnight decisions about grain distribution and storage can determine whether distant populations will have adequate food supplies during harsh winter months. Ledger books filled with harvest statistics from across the empire provide the numerical foundation for policies that must balance regional needs with imperial revenues. Letters from agricultural administrators describe experimental farming techniques being tested in different regions, with careful documentation of which crops perform best under specific soil and climate conditions. Catherine reviews reports comparing traditional Russian farming methods with innovations learned from European agricultural science, considering how new techniques might increase productivity without disrupting social systems that depend on established rural practices. Correspondence about grain storage facilities discusses the engineering challenges of preserving large quantities of harvested crops through seasons when transportation becomes difficult or impossible. Catherine examines proposals for constructing granaries that can maintain proper temperature and humidity levels while protecting stored grain from rodents and moisture damage that could destroy supplies essential for feeding both rural and urban populations. A detailed letter from administrators managing imperial estates describes crop rotation systems that maintain soil fertility while maximizing agricultural output. The technical discussion includes specific recommendations for which crops should be planted in particular fields during upcoming growing seasons, based on careful observation of soil conditions and previous harvest results. Letters from regional markets provide information about grain prices and trading patterns that help Catherine understand how agricultural policies affect economic conditions in different parts of the empire. Merchants describe seasonal price fluctuations and transportation costs that influence whether it becomes profitable to move grain from surplus regions to areas experiencing shortages. Correspondence with European agricultural experts discusses new farming equipment and techniques that might be adapted for Russian conditions, including improved plows and harvesting tools that could increase efficiency while reducing the physical demands placed on rural workers. Catherine considers how such innovations might be introduced gradually to avoid disrupting established agricultural communities. The economic correspondence reveals careful attention to the relationship between agricultural production and imperial revenues, with detailed calculations showing how changes in farming practices might affect tax collection and export earnings. Catherine reviews projections estimating how increased grain production could support population growth while providing surplus crops for international trade. Letters describing livestock management discuss breeding programs designed to improve the quality of cattle and sheep, while maintaining herds large enough to provide meat, dairy products, and wool for both local consumption and commercial markets. Agricultural administrators report on experimental breeding techniques and their results, helping Catherine understand which approaches might be expanded to other regions. At her natural philosophy desk, Catherine encounters correspondence about scientific expeditions and discoveries that reflect her commitment to advancing human knowledge through imperial patronage of scholarly investigation. Letters from scientists request funding for research projects that promise to expand understanding of natural phenomena while potentially providing practical benefits for imperial development. A letter from astronomers describes observations of celestial phenomena that require more sophisticated instruments for detailed study. The scientists explain how improved telescopes and measuring devices would allow more accurate mapping of stellar movements and planetary positions, contributing to navigation techniques that could benefit both military and commercial maritime activities. Correspondence from botanical expeditions describes plant species discovered in remote imperial territories, including detailed drawings and pressed specimens that accompany written descriptions of potential medicinal or agricultural applications. Catherine reviews proposals for establishing botanical gardens where such discoveries can be cultivated and studied under controlled conditions. Letters from geological surveys describe mineral deposits and rock formations that provide information about imperial natural resources, while contributing to theoretical understanding of how geological processes shape terrestrial landscapes. The scientific reports include technical terminology and mathematical calculations that Catherine studies carefully, appreciating both the practical and intellectual value of such investigations. A detailed proposal from natural philosophers describes plans for establishing an imperial academy where scientists from across Europe could collaborate on research projects while training Russian students in advanced scientific methods. Catherine considers how such an institution might enhance imperial prestige while advancing practical knowledge that could benefit agricultural, military, and commercial development. Correspondence with medical researchers discusses studies of diseases that affect both human and animal populations, including proposals for investigating traditional remedies used by indigenous peoples alongside European medical techniques. The letters describe careful procedures for testing treatments while documenting results that could lead to improved health care throughout the empire. Letters from mathematical scholars describe theoretical investigations that might seem abstract but could eventually contribute to practical applications in engineering, architecture, and navigation. Catherine reads about geometric principles and algebraic methods while considering how mathematical education might be expanded to produce more skilled administrators and technical specialists. The scientific correspondence demonstrates Catherine's understanding that imperial greatness requires more than military and economic power, encompassing cultural and intellectual achievements that reflect enlightened governance committed to advancing human knowledge and improving living conditions for imperial subjects. In the family correspondence corner, surrounded by portraits of relatives whose faces remind her of personal relationships that exist alongside imperial responsibilities, Catherine confronts letters that reveal the human heart behind the imperial crown. Here, maternal concerns about succession and family welfare create emotional complexities that no amount of political wisdom can entirely resolve. A letter from her son Paul discusses his education and preparation for eventual imperial responsibilities, revealing both his intellectual development and personality traits that will shape his future governance. Catherine responds with careful advice about balancing personal inclinations with imperial duties, understanding that her guidance must prepare him for challenges she has faced, while allowing him to develop his own approach to leadership. Correspondence about family financial arrangements discusses provisions for relatives whose welfare depends on imperial generosity, including decisions about estates and allowances that must balance family loyalty with responsible management of imperial resources. Catherine reviews requests and proposals while considering how family policies might affect broader imperial administration. Letters describing her grandson's development reveal Catherine's hopes that future generations will continue the cultural and political achievements of her reign, while adapting to changing circumstances that will require different skills and approaches. She reads tutors' reports about their academic progress and personality development with the careful attention of someone who understands that personal education shapes imperial destiny. A particularly personal letter discusses health concerns affecting family members, revealing Catherine's awareness that imperial power cannot protect loved ones from illness and aging that affect all human beings regardless of their social position. Her responses demonstrate both maternal affection and the practical understanding that family health issues must be managed alongside imperial responsibilities. Correspondence about marriage arrangements for younger relatives involves delicate negotiations that must balance family preferences with diplomatic considerations, as aristocratic marriages create political relationships that extend beyond personal happiness. Catherine weighs emotional factors against strategic implications, while understanding that family decisions inevitably become matters of imperial policy. The family letters reveal fears about succession that no empress can entirely escape, including concerns about whether her policies and achievements will survive future changes in imperial leadership. Catherine writes about preserving institutional reforms and cultural developments, while recognizing that each ruler must adapt imperial governance to their own time and circumstances. As midnight deepens and the candles burn lower, Catherine completes another evening of correspondence that has ranged from artistic acquisitions to provincial administration, agricultural planning to scientific patronage, family concerns to imperial legacy. The letters scattered across multiple desks represent the constant demands of governing an empire where personal decisions become public policy, where midnight reflections shape daytime actions, and where an empress must balance competing responsibilities that never allow complete rest or simple solutions. Tomorrow will bring fresh correspondence requiring equally careful attention, as the Midnight Cabinet continues its essential work of transforming private deliberation into public governance that serves both immediate needs and long-term imperial development. The compass needle trembles against the architectural drawing as Catherine adjusts the oil lamp, casting wavering shadows across the sketched foundations of what will become Odessa. Her fingers trace the planned harbour walls while snow continues its patient accumulation against the palace windows, each flake adding to the winter that has settled over her empire like a contemplative blanket. I am your DrowZy historian, and we find ourselves in the building project planning room where Catherine's midnight correspondence takes on the weight of stone and mortar. Here, surrounded by rolled blueprints and cost estimates written in careful script, the Empress shapes cities that exist only in possibility, their future streets mapped in ink across papers that rustle with each movement of her hand. The architectural drawings spread before her represent more than construction projects. Each planned boulevard carries the promise of commerce, each designated square the hope of civic life that might flourish under Russian governance. Catherine's pen moves between correspondence with her architects and engineers, men who must translate imperial vision into practical foundations that can withstand both weather and time. A letter from Yemelian Velton details the complexities of building in marshy ground, his precise handwriting explaining how wooden pilings must be driven deep enough to support the weight of administrative buildings that will house the expanding bureaucracy. Catherine responds with questions about drainage systems and foundation costs, her practical mind engaged with problems that require solutions measured in rubles and construction seasons. The model buildings scattered across the planning table catch the lamplight like miniature cities waiting to be born. Wooden blocks represent palaces, carved pieces suggest churches, small paper squares mark out residential districts where families will eventually make their homes. Catherine moves these pieces with careful consideration, understanding that each placement decision will influence how people live, work, and gather in communities that do not yet exist beyond these midnight sketches. Her correspondence with Charles Cameron reveals the delicate balance between architectural ambition and financial reality. The Scottish architect's letters describe neoclassical designs that would rival the finest European palaces, while Catherine's responses weigh such grandeur against the practical needs of provincial administration and the limitations of imperial treasury resources that must fund multiple construction projects simultaneously. The building cost estimates spread across her desk tell their own story of imperial expansion. Materials must be transported across vast distances, skilled craftsmen recruited from established cities, local labor trained in construction techniques that differ from traditional Russian building methods. Catherine's midnight calculations involve more than architectural aesthetics. They require understanding how construction projects can stimulate local economies, while serving broader imperial purposes. A draft letter to Giacomo Quarenghi discusses the planned expansion of the Winter Palace itself, additional wings that will accommodate the growing court, and the expanding collection of art and artifacts that Catherine continues acquiring from across Europe. The Italian architect's suggestions for improved heating systems and better natural lighting reflect practical concerns that palace residents understand intimately during long winter months. The planning room grows quieter as Catherine works through correspondence about infrastructure projects that will connect these new cities to existing trade routes. Letters detail canal construction, road improvements, bridge building across rivers that currently limit commerce and communication between distant provinces. Each engineering project represents an investment in imperial unity, physical connections that will strengthen political and economic bonds across her vast territories. Her pen scratches against paper as she responds to questions about timber supplies and stone quarries, iron foundries and glass workshops that must be established or expanded to support the ambitious construction schedule. Catherine's midnight planning involves coordinating resources across an empire where distances make communication slow and supply chains vulnerable to weather and political disruption. The architectural drawings reveal Catherine's understanding that building cities requires more than constructing individual buildings. Her correspondence addresses the need for markets and schools, hospitals and theaters, the civic institutions that transform collections of structures into functioning communities where people can build productive lives under Russian governance. As the night deepens, Catherine moves to the naval correspondence desk, where charts of the Black Sea spread beneath letters sealed with anchor insignia. The maritime expansion she envisions depends partly on the harbor cities being planned in the building project room, coastal settlements that will serve both commercial and strategic purposes in regions where Russian naval presence remains limited. Admiral Fyodor Ushakov's latest report describes the challenges of establishing naval bases in newly acquired territories where existing facilities cannot accommodate the larger ships Catherine's expansion plans require. His careful handwriting details the engineering complexities of harbor construction, the need for deeper channels and stronger fortifications that can protect both merchant vessels and military fleets from seasonal storms and potential enemies. Catherine's response reveals her understanding that naval expansion involves more than building ships. Her letters address the recruitment and training of sailors, the establishment of naval academies where officers can learn navigation and ship management skills that differ significantly from land-based military knowledge. The correspondence reveals practical concerns about supplying remote naval stations with food, ammunition, and repair materials that must often travel great distances across challenging terrain. The wind patterns marked on the naval charts influence Catherine's strategic thinking about trade routes and exploration possibilities. Her midnight correspondence with navigators and cartographers discusses seasonal sailing conditions, the potential for discovering new fishing grounds, and the commercial opportunities that might develop as Russian ships venture into waters previously dominated by other maritime powers. Letters from shipbuilders describe the technical challenges of constructing vessels capable of operating in both the Baltic and Black Seas, different water conditions that require adaptations in hull design and rigging systems. Catherine's responses demonstrate a grasp of naval architecture details that affect both ship performance and construction costs, practical considerations that influence how quickly her maritime expansion plans can be implemented. The compass rose drawn on one chart catches the lamplight as Catherine considers correspondence about exploration missions that will map coastlines and identify safe harbors along routes where Russian merchants might eventually establish regular trading relationships. These letters reveal her interest in geographical knowledge that extends beyond immediate military or commercial concerns, scientific curiosity about regions that remain incompletely understood. Her correspondence with naval suppliers addresses the complex logistics of maintaining fleets that operate far from established bases. Letters detail the challenges of preserving food for long voyages, manufacturing rope and canvas that can withstand saltwater exposure, and training medical personnel who can treat injuries and illnesses that occur during extended time at sea. The naval expansion correspondence reveals Catherine's awareness that maritime power requires sustained investment over many years. Her letters discuss the establishment of timber reserves for shipbuilding, the recruitment of foreign naval experts who can share technical knowledge, and the diplomatic negotiations necessary to secure access to ports where Russian ships might require emergency repairs or supply replenishment. As dawn approaches, Catherine moves to her morning preparation room where imperial regalia waits to transform the midnight correspondent into the public empress. The mirror reflects a face marked by hours of concentrated writing, eyes that have focused on details of governance that her subjects will experience as policies and programs rather than personal decisions made in solitude. The completed letters arranged on nearby tables represent the night's transformation of private reflection into public action. Each sealed document will travel through channels that connect the Empress to administrators, military officers, merchants, and regional governors who depend on her guidance for decisions that affect thousands of lives across her vast territories. Catherine's morning ritual involves more than changing clothes and arranging hair. The mental shift from private writer to public ruler requires setting aside the intimate engagement with correspondence details and assuming the ceremonial presence that court protocol demands. The transformation happens gradually as she prepares to meet with ministers and receive foreign ambassadors who will see only the imperial surface of decisions that emerged from midnight solitude. The letters ready for dispatch reveal the scope of concerns that occupy Catherine's attention during hours when most of her subjects sleep peacefully in their beds. Agricultural reforms and architectural projects, naval expansion and educational initiatives, family matters and diplomatic negotiations all require the same careful consideration, the same precise attention to details that can influence outcomes across vast distances and extended time periods. Her reflection in the morning mirror shows the face of someone who has spent the night engaged with the practical complexities of governing an empire where personal decisions become public policies. The tired but determined expression reveals the weight of responsibilities that cannot be shared or delegated, choices that only the Empress can make based on information and insights that reach her through the midnight correspondence networks. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminates the contrast between Catherine's private writing hours and the public duties that await her. The intimate engagement with letters and documents must give way to ceremonial appearances and formal meetings where spontaneous conversation is limited and genuine discussion often impossible due to court protocols and diplomatic necessities. At the palace gates, mounted couriers receive their sealed dispatch pouches with the quiet efficiency of men who understand the importance of their cargo without necessarily knowing its contents. The horses paw the ground eagerly, sensing their riders' readiness to depart on journeys that will carry Catherine's midnight decisions across snow-covered roads to distant cities, where administrators wait for guidance on matters that cannot be resolved without imperial direction. The courier's journey represents the final stage of Catherine's correspondence process, the moment when private deliberation becomes public action through the physical transport of sealed documents across her empire. Each horseman carries letters that will influence how provincial governors respond to local crises, how military commanders deploy their forces, how merchants arrange their trading schedules according to new regulations or opportunities. The snowy Russian landscape revealed beyond the opening palace, gates stretches toward horizons where Catherine's letters will eventually reach recipients who may never see the Empress in person, but whose lives are shaped by decisions made during her midnight writing sessions. The correspondence network connects the intimate scale of personal handwriting to the vast scope of imperial governance, individual pen strokes that influence the daily experiences of millions of subjects. The dispatch pouches contain more than administrative instructions. They carry Catherine's personality and perspective into regions where imperial authority must be exercised by subordinates who depend on written guidance to understand how the Empress expects them to balance competing demands and navigate complex situations that require both flexibility and consistency with broader policy objectives. As the couriers disappear into the winter morning, their hoofbeats gradually fade into the distance, leaving behind the quiet palace where Catherine's night of correspondence has concluded, but where the effects of her midnight writing will continue to unfold across time and space in ways that even she cannot fully anticipate or control. The empty study at dawn holds the lingering presence of completed work, papers scattered across multiple desks bearing witness to the night's engagement with imperial responsibilities that never fully rest. The extinguished candle beside the inkstand marks the end of another session in Catherine's ongoing correspondence with her empire, the daily renewal of connections between personal reflection and public governance. The morning light illuminates the tools of written communication that have enabled Catherine to maintain intimate contact with the vast territories and diverse populations under her rule. The quill pen resting in its stand represents the simple technology that transforms private thoughts into public policies, individual decisions into collective experiences that shape how people live, work, and relate to imperial authority across her domains. The scattered papers reveal the breadth of concerns that occupy Catherine's midnight attention, documents that demonstrate how governing an empire requires constant engagement with details that range from architectural specifications to naval logistics, from agricultural innovations to diplomatic protocols. Each letter represents a connection between the Empress and subjects whose lives depend on decisions made in the solitude of her writing hours. The sense of completed work that pervades the dawn study reflects not the conclusion of Catherine's correspondence responsibilities, but rather the satisfaction of another night's engagement with the ongoing process of imperial governance. Tomorrow will bring fresh letters requiring equally careful attention, new challenges that cannot be anticipated, but must be addressed with the same combination of practical wisdom and personal commitment that has characterized her midnight writing sessions. The empty room holds the echo of Catherine's voice speaking through written words to administrators and advisors, military officers and provincial governors who will receive her letters as guidance for decisions that affect thousands of lives across distances too great for direct communication. The correspondence network enables the Empress to extend her personal attention across her empire, maintaining connections that transform imperial authority from distant abstraction into intimate engagement with the practical challenges of governance. As morning settles over the winter palace, the night's correspondence work joins the accumulated archive of Catherine's written communication with her empire, letters that document not only the administrative decisions of her reign, but also the personal engagement and careful attention that she brought to the daily responsibilities of ruling territories and populations that stretched across continents and cultures. The lasting power of these midnight letters lies not in their immediate administrative effects, but in their demonstration that effective governance requires sustained personal attention to details that cannot be delegated or simplified. Catherine's correspondence reveals an empress who understood that imperial authority must be renewed daily through intimate engagement with the practical challenges and human complexities that define the experience of governing diverse populations across vast territories under constantly changing circumstances. The economic planning chamber draws Catherine deeper into the empire's agricultural heartbeat. Ledger books spread across mahogany surfaces reveal the intricate mathematics of feeding millions, harvest reports from Ukraine's Black Earth, grain shipments from the Volga Basin, livestock counts from distant steppes. Her fingers trace columns of numbers that represent not merely statistics, but the sustenance of her people through winter months that could stretch survival to breaking points. A letter from Governor Rumyantsev describes wheat yields that exceeded expectations despite late spring floods. Catherine's marginal note calculates surplus grain that might be stored against future shortages or traded for Swedish iron. The correspondence reveals how midnight decisions about agricultural policy rippled across seasons and provinces, determining whether distant villages would prosper or merely survive the coming year. Small bowls contain samples of different grains: barley from Arkhangelsk, rye from Novgorod, oats from territories recently acquired from Poland. Catherine examines each variety, understanding that successful governance required intimate knowledge of the resources that sustained her empire's foundation. Her letters to provincial administrators contained specific instructions about seed distribution, storage techniques, and transportation networks that connected rural production with urban consumption. The calculating abacus beside her elbow bears witness to hours spent balancing agricultural income against military expenses, infrastructure investments against immediate needs. A broken wafer seal on one letter suggests the urgency with which economic reports traveled from distant provinces, arriving with news that demanded immediate attention and careful response. Regional harvest reports painted detailed pictures of local conditions that shaped imperial policy. Catherine's correspondence with estate managers revealed her understanding that agricultural prosperity depended upon treating serfs with sufficient consideration to maintain productivity, while extracting enough surplus to fund the military and administrative apparatus that protected agricultural regions from external threats. The Natural Philosophy desk occupies a corner where scientific curiosity intersects with imperial responsibility. Letters from the Academy of Sciences describe expeditions that Catherine funded to explore Siberian resources, map Arctic coastlines, and catalogue botanical specimens that might prove useful for medicine or agriculture. Her correspondence with scholars reveals an empress who understood that knowledge itself constituted a form of wealth that could strengthen her empire's competitive position. Scientific instruments scattered across the desktop, telescope, astrolabe, botanical drawings, suggest the breadth of Catherine's intellectual interests. Her letters supporting research expeditions demonstrate how imperial patronage enabled discoveries that expanded Russian understanding of territories that remained largely unmapped and unexplored. A secretary's sand shaker sits ready to dry ink on letters authorizing funding for scientific ventures that might not yield immediate practical benefits, but could provide long-term advantages. Specimen jars contain samples collected during expeditions that Catherine commissioned to investigate natural resources in recently acquired territories. Her correspondence with expedition leaders reveals careful attention to reports about mineral deposits, timber resources, and geographical features that could influence future settlement patterns or military strategies. Letters with mathematical calculations document Catherine's engagement with scientific problems that interested her personally, while potentially benefiting her empire. Her correspondence with European scholars demonstrates how intellectual exchange strengthened diplomatic relationships, while advancing Russian participation in Enlightenment scientific culture that was reshaping European civilization. The family correspondence corner holds papers that reveal the private woman behind the public empress. Personal letters about succession planning show Catherine grappling with decisions that would determine Russia's future long after her own death. Her maternal concerns about Paul's education and character appear in correspondence with tutors and advisors who shaped the heir's development during crucial formative years. Family portraits in ornate frames watch over letters that document Catherine's attempts to balance personal relationships with imperial responsibilities. A locket containing a miniature portrait rests beside correspondence about marriage negotiations that could strengthen Russia's diplomatic position while providing personal happiness for family members whose lives remained subordinated to political necessity. Dried flowers pressed between pages of personal letters suggest moments of tenderness preserved amid the relentless demands of imperial duty. Catherine's private correspondence reveals a mother who worried about her son's readiness for responsibilities that would eventually transfer to him, concerns that shaped her approach to governance during years when she prepared Russia for transition to new leadership. The human heart behind the imperial crown appears most clearly in letters that Catherine wrote but may never have sent, expressing doubts and fears that could not be shared with advisors or confidants. Her private writings reveal the emotional cost of maintaining public authority while navigating family relationships that remained complicated by political considerations beyond personal control. Building project planning consumes another section of the midnight workspace. Architectural drawings spread across tables show Catherine's vision for cities that would demonstrate Russian cultural sophistication while providing practical benefits for regional development. Her correspondence with architects reveals detailed attention to projects that would reshape the physical landscape of her empire. Compass and ruler rest beside letters discussing construction costs for palaces that would house provincial governors, fortifications that would protect vulnerable frontiers, and public buildings that would serve growing urban populations. Small models of proposed buildings allow Catherine to visualize projects before committing resources to construction that might continue for decades beyond her own reign. A folded map corner reveals territorial planning that extended beyond immediate military or administrative needs toward long-term development strategies. Catherine's letters to regional planners demonstrate understanding that successful governance required creating infrastructure that would support population growth and economic expansion in territories that remained largely undeveloped. Letters with building cost estimates show Catherine balancing architectural ambitions against fiscal realities, making decisions about projects that would consume significant resources while potentially providing benefits that might not become apparent for generations. Her correspondence about urban planning reveals an empress who thought systematically about how physical spaces could shape social relationships and cultural development. Naval correspondence occupies the desk where Catherine planned Russia's maritime expansion. Charts showing wind patterns and ocean currents reflect her understanding that naval power required detailed knowledge of natural conditions that influenced ship movements across distances too great for direct communication or control. Ship blueprints document Catherine's attention to vessel design that could serve both military and commercial purposes, extending Russian influence into waters that had remained dominated by other European powers. Her letters to Admiralty officials reveal systematic planning for naval development that would continue long after immediate strategic objectives had been achieved. A compass rose decorates letters sealed with anchor insignia, correspondence that directed naval exploration of coastlines that might provide harbors for future expansion or resources that could strengthen Russia's competitive position. Catherine's naval planning demonstrates understanding that maritime power constituted an essential component of imperial strength in an era when ocean access determined commercial and military capabilities. Orders for naval construction reveal Catherine's long-term vision for Russian sea power that would challenge established maritime nations while opening new territories for settlement and resource extraction. Her correspondence with shipbuilders shows detailed attention to technical specifications that would enable Russian vessels to operate effectively in Arctic conditions that remained largely unexplored by other European navies. Morning preparation transforms Catherine from private correspondent into public empress. Imperial regalia laid out for the coming day represents the ceremonial aspects of authority that must be performed regardless of personal fatigue or private concerns that occupied midnight hours. A porcelain inkstand holds the final drops of ink that completed the night's correspondence work. The mirror reflects a face marked by hours of concentrated attention to details that could not be delegated or postponed. Catherine's morning ritual demonstrates how personal discipline enabled her to maintain public authority while managing private responsibilities that remained invisible to subjects who saw only the ceremonial aspects of imperial power. Completed letters await dispatch to destinations across the empire and beyond, carrying decisions that will influence events Catherine may never witness directly. Her morning preparation reveals the transformation required daily to convert private thoughts and personal concerns into public policies that must be communicated with authority and precision. A courier bell announces the arrival of messengers who will carry the night's correspondence toward its intended recipients. The transition from private writing to public communication demonstrates how individual decisions become collective policies through networks of communication that extend imperial authority across distances too great for personal presence. Palace gates open at sunrise to reveal mounted couriers receiving sealed dispatch pouches that contain the night's governmental decisions. Horses paw the ground eagerly, sensing the urgency of missions that will carry Catherine's written words across snowy landscapes toward provincial capitals and frontier outposts, where her letters will guide local administrators facing challenges she can anticipate but not directly control. The courier's journey begins as palace gates frame a view of the Russian landscape stretching toward horizons that mark the boundaries of Catherine's authority. Snow-covered roads will carry her correspondence toward destinations where written words must substitute for personal presence, extending imperial governance through communication networks that connect the Winter Palace with administrative centers scattered across continents. Sealed pouches contain letters that represent hours of careful consideration applied to problems that require immediate attention despite the delays inherent in long-distance communication. The couriers departing at sunrise carry Catherine's midnight decisions toward implementation in circumstances that may have changed significantly during the time required for correspondence to reach its destination. The morning departure of messengers completes the cycle that begins with Catherine's solitary writing and extends through networks of communication that transform personal decisions into collective policies. Her letters will travel for weeks through weather conditions and territorial challenges that could delay or prevent their arrival. Yet the correspondence network remains essential for maintaining imperial authority across distances that cannot be governed through direct personal supervision. The empty study holds morning light that illuminates scattered papers documenting a night's work that will influence events across the empire for months or years to come. An extinguished candle marks the completion of correspondence sessions that required sustained attention to details that could not be simplified or abbreviated without losing essential meaning. Catherine's writing desk bears the accumulated evidence of governance conducted through personal engagement with problems that demanded individual attention despite their collective implications. The quill pen resting in its stand suggests the intimate connection between personal discipline and imperial authority that characterizes effective governance under circumstances that require constant adaptation to changing conditions. Morning ash in candle cups provides silent testimony to hours spent converting private thoughts into public policies through written communication that must bridge gaps between intention and implementation across territories too vast for direct supervision. The sense of completed work pervades the study where Catherine's midnight letters join the accumulated archive of correspondence that documents her reign's daily attention to governing challenges that required both immediate response and long-term planning. The lasting power of words written in solitude appears in the empty room where Catherine's voice continues to speak through letters that will influence decisions made by administrators and military officers who must interpret her written guidance according to local conditions that she cannot directly observe or control. The correspondence network enables personal authority to extend across imperial territories through intimate engagement with practical problems that define the experience of governing diverse populations under constantly changing circumstances. The echo of empires resonates in the dawn-lit study where Catherine's midnight writing sessions demonstrate how effective governance emerges from sustained personal attention to details that cannot be delegated or simplified. Her correspondence reveals an empress who understood that imperial authority must be renewed daily through written communication that transforms individual decisions into collective policies capable of guiding administrative action across distances and cultures that remain beyond direct personal influence. The morning silence holds space for dreams that may come easily now, carrying forward the satisfaction of correspondence completed and decisions made with the careful attention that governance requires during hours when the empire sleeps and the empress works alone with paper and ink, and the endless responsibility of ruling territories that stretch beyond any single person's capacity for direct supervision or control.